Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Content Patch for the 7th of November 2012. My name is TotalBiscuit, bringing you around 20 minutes of gaming news and comment. Coming up in the show, bad news for THQ as they post $21 million loss, Dragon's Dogma on the subject of new graphics tricks and the feel of 60 frames per second, Hitman developer IO Interactive on educating players about the freedom of choice, Guitar Hero co-creator talks about mobiles replacing consoles, and Capcom shifting away from outsourcing. You know, I really hate to be the bearer of bad news. Unfortunately, when it comes to THQ, this seems to be the case at the moment, although there is a little bit of a silver lining to this particular cloud. THQ has posted a $21 million loss and has announced the delay of 3 key titles: South Park, The Stick of Truth, Metro Last Light, and Company of Heroes 2. Each title has been pushed back about 2 months, and in a statement from THQ's president Jason Rubin, he said that the 3 games needed additional development time to be market-ready. In an investor call, he went on to comment that Company of Heroes 2, Metro Last Light, and South Park, The Stick of Truth were all challenged and were guaranteed to fall short of their design specs if forced to meet their announced release schedules. He also appeared to have particular optimism for the South Park release, assuming it was actually given the time to be finished. This is fairly significant for any of you that happen to be fans of Obsidian, because they have something of a reputation for developing some very interesting games, but not being given the chance to actually finish them. As regards to the loss, they are seeking financing alternatives and are working with a company by the name of Centerview Partners, who are a private equity and investment firm, to attempt to find additional capital. So it's not really terrible news as of yet, but it's definitely not helpful. There was also some news about Darksiders 2, which appears to have actually sold a little bit more than we initially believed. The sequel from Vigil Games has currently shipped 1.4 million copies during the quarter, which the THQ president deemed as great. So it's not terrible for THQ, but it's certainly not helping matters. They've been having an awful lot of bad news as of late, and it seems to be continuing to cause them problems and, of course, reductions in their share value. Now, I've got to say, I do applaud the fact that THQ is holding on to some of these very important titles, because each one of them is potentially huge. The South Park game could really sell well, the graphic style is very interesting, and South Park fans, as well as people that are just interested in the kind of parody that Trey Parker and Matt Stone can actually throw out there when it comes to gaming, will be keeping an eye on it. It is an Obsidian RPG, after all. And then, of course, you do have Metro Last Light, which is a sequel to a fairly successful and very interesting hardcore FPS. I enjoyed Metro a great deal, and PC gamers in particular should be interested in that, because the original Metro 2034 happened to have some fairly significant graphical technology behind it. And last but, of course, no means least, and of big interest to PC owners, Company of Heroes 2, one of the most successful RTS in recent years, in a marketplace which is very much devoid of RTS titles at the moment. This is a big deal as well. So screwing any of these up could very well be another nail in the coffin of THQ. The success of these games could turn the fortunes of the company around. Although I've got to say that recently I don't honestly believe that THQ releasing games too early really had an awful lot to do with their lack of success. Darksiders 2 was not released too early. Its PC port was a bit dodgy in places, but that seemed to be more down to ignorance when it comes to Vigil Games as opposed to anything else. It's not that they weren't capable of it, it's not that they ran out of time, and the game was not exactly a buggy mess that was missing content either. Other games that THQ released in 2012 and, of course, back to 2011 include Nexus. They actually published that. You Don't Know Jack, the remake, the 2 WWE games, which were actually pretty good, including All-Stars, which was a ton of fun, I might add. Space Marine, Dawn of War 2 Retribution, also not really lacking features, clearly not unfinished. Voltron Defender of the Universe, which just kind of sucked. They published Stacking, which was, of course, a game from Double Fine. And then, of course, the major release for that year, which was considered to be the game that very much carried their financial year in 2011, that was Saints Row the Third. They also had Red Faction Armageddon in that year. Homefront came out that year as well. but I don't really see on that list of games anything that I would consider to be a game that failed due to lack of work and the fact that it was released too early. Homefront is probably the most flawed game on that list, alongside, of course, Voltron, and that was more down to stupid design choices than actual time spent. So, while it's positive that they're going to actually spend some time making these games good, I don't know if that is going to be enough to save them, or indeed if whether that actually had anything to do with the recent slips that THQ seem to be having on the financial front. Ninja Theory has been speaking on the subject of the newest Devil May Cry game and talking about the issue of 30 versus 60 frames per second. It's been known for quite some time now that Devil May Cry will be running at 30 frames per second on PlayStation 3 and 360, although the PC version will be running at 60 FPS, and it is claimed by Ninja Theory that a number of techniques have been developed over the course of work on Dragon's Dogma to make 30 FPS look and feel more like 60 frames per second. Now, needless to say, a number of the series fans have been just a little bit concerned about this, and no one is very surprised by that at all, because this is a pretty hardcore spectacle fighter, and the smoothness of the combat is, of course, paramount. Previous games in the series have run at 60 frames per second. Director Hideaki Itsuno insisted that 60 frames per second would be better, but the game will also be responsible enough to satisfy fans at 30 frames per second. Quote, during the course of the development of Dragon's Dogma, we did a lot of experimentation and happened upon some techniques for working with Unreal Engine, some fairly elaborate techniques that allowed for controller responsiveness that gives the player the feel of 60 frames per second. Now, while it is of course good news that they recognize the problem with 30 frames per second versus 60, and understandable that in the age of aging console hardware, brand new games would not necessarily run at 60 frames per second. Rather concerning quote appeared later on in this article, which you can read in full by clicking on it in the description below this video, that said action games that run at 60 frames per second can have a tiring effect on players' eyes after a long time because the frames themselves almost shake or flash. Because of this, adjusting the speed is almost necessary. That is a very interesting point, honestly, and something that I haven't really honestly heard about before. That's a weird one, isn't it? That's really weird. The article goes on, of course, to brag about Devil May Cry and also give reasons for the choice for 30 FPS, basically because they couldn't get the look they wanted for the game and also maintain 60 frames per second because consoles are really old. So it's once again a case of graphical prowess over actual fluidity of gameplay, which as far as I'm concerned when it comes to spectacle fighters should not be top of the list. Yes, of course, the graphical prowess of a game helps provide the spectacle, but for me it's all about smooth gameplay. I'm really concerned that someone of such prominence can just come out and say, oh, 60 frames per second tires players out. Since when? Exactly, since when? Because right now I'm sitting in a house full of pro gamers that all play far beyond that for almost upwards of 12 hours a day. It doesn't have a tiring effect on them. They seem completely capable of dealing with it. Think about Counter-Strike and Quake pro gamers playing on old CRT monitors. Counter-Strike players playing at 1,000 frames per second or more when necessary. It's pretty insane to suggest that it has a tiring effect and that's actually an excuse, and that games developers should be looking at 30 FPS to make sure the players don't get tired out. I don't see any scientific evidence of that, and it's a rather worrying statement indeed. When it comes down to the 30 versus 60 FPS thing, it's not just the fact that the game looks and feels smoother. The feel of it being smoother is down to controller responsiveness. If you have 30 frames per second, that means there are 30 times every second where an input can be recognized and actually implemented on the screen. At 60 frames per second, that's, of course, double that number. Why do you think it was that Counter-Strike players played at such high frame rates? They did it to ensure that the response time was as low as humanly possible. Needless to say, you do get something of diminishing returns. You get to the point where it just doesn't really make a huge amount of difference. But between 30 and 60, I do find it very difficult to play first-person shooters at that speed. I really do, and if I can't get it to 60, then I don't want to play it. I find myself being noticeably worse at video games, and it's definitely concerning. I think if you saw Street Fighter running at 30 frames per second on any hardware, then you would be very concerned indeed, and the fighting game community probably wouldn't be too happy with that either. All in all, I guess I'm just glad that the current console generation is coming to an end, and we do have something of a stopgap with a little bit more horsepower under the hood coming very soon indeed in the form of the Wii U. So let's see what Bayonetta 2 does on there, because I can guarantee that it wouldn't be particularly good on the current generation. In a recent interview with Gama Sutra, IO Interactive, the developers of Hitman, have discussed how difficult it can actually be to educate players about individual choice and the ability to think outside the box. They stated that, quote, "It's quite difficult actually to educate players that this is what the game is trying to serve you, because people are increasingly used to games where you are told to do one thing, and if you stray from this line, there will be nothing else around. It's like you have this experience, and that's it. So we're telling people actually, no, you actually choose by yourself." Now, this is an interesting interview for a couple of reasons. The first being that it somewhat mirrors the interview with Games on Net with the developers of Dishonored, Arcane Studios, that were having similar problems, especially in playtests, claiming that some playtesters, when told by guards you can't go up there, would just simply freeze and just never do it, because the game is saying, no, you can't do it, and they're very much used to being told by games exactly what they can and cannot do. I think if you've ever experienced an MMS's single-player campaign, something like Medal of Honor, Call of Duty, then you will run into a great deal of moments like this. You are outside the boundaries. No, you can't enter this door because you haven't triggered this specific thing, or your teammate hasn't opened it for you, and so on and so forth. The second point that's interesting about it is that this is a game series that is coming back after several years. The last game in the series, Blood Money, came out in 2006. That is quite some time ago. It's been over 6 years since we've actually had a Hitman game, and this is a series that is very much based on the idea of freedom to attack your target in a variety of different ways, and even some elements of emergent gameplay. Now, this interview is very interesting, and of course you should read the whole thing over on the original site. Link is in the description below this video. But if I'm honest, I've got to be just a little bit concerned about this when it comes down to it. This is a series that has very much been built on the principles of player freedom, emergent gameplay, and challenge. The first game didn't even have checkpoints. It was hard, and there hasn't actually been an easy Hitman game at any point. It is a stealth action game, a true stealth action game, and it is very, very good at what it does. But of course, it does have a limited audience. Even though it's been fairly successful, it still limits its audience by the fact that it is still a hard game. One has to wonder if these reactions would actually change the attitude and force certain things from IO Interactive. It doesn't appear to have gone that way, at least according to the interview. IO seems to be fairly adamant that they will not change the game, but they have admitted that it was difficult in order to try and get players to think outside of the box, and as a result you may find that you are led around just a little bit in the first couple of missions. I am quite excited to hear that the game will feature no less than 5 difficulty levels, which is absolutely fantastic, including a very hard difficulty with no hints, no checkpoints, no HUD. So that's particularly crazy. We'll see how this turns out. I really do hope that it's a great follow-up, however, because Dishonored was an excellent example of stealth action and emergent gameplay and player choice. We need more games like that. What I've seen thus far, I did get to actually play a little bit of Hitman Absolution at a press event prior to PAX, and it seemed like there was a possibility that this would be the case, that the gameplay of the Hitman games has got through pretty much intact. There have been a couple of concessions to modern gameplay standards, but they all seem to be optional one way or the other. I'm intrigued to see how it turns out, and I'm looking forward to bringing you coverage on this title as soon as I'm able to actually get a gameplay video together. Co-creator of Guitar Hero Charles Hwang has some interesting opinions on the subject of the future of gaming when it comes to mobile devices. He's working with a company called Green Throttle Games, a 12-person startup, looking to launch a special game controller next year that actually uses Android smartphones and tablets. The controller will connect wirelessly to the Android device, which of course is supposed to be then plugged into the television via an HDMI cable. Charles is quoted as saying, "Mobile gaming is exploding and new smart devices are becoming powerful alternatives to traditional consoles. We just need a simple and fun way for people to play games both on the go and on the couch. Our mission is to create great game experiences that bring people together, a big screen experience where you can start playing games on a television. Simple as that." It's an interesting idea, and it's something that's gaining some traction. The success of the Kickstarter for the Ouya, whatever the hell you want to call it, and the Moga device could potentially allow for console quality gaming to some degree, obviously not graphically as impressive, but games that are as complex and as playable. But the biggest challenge, I feel, has got to be down to the interface. Now, I've got to say that what he's doing isn't exactly new. There are a number of different devices that allow for this to happen, although for the most part, they involve a weird jury-rigged kind of setup. The way the iCade works, for instance, it emulates a lot of keyboard inputs as opposed to being a true controller for the actual machine itself, and especially for iOS devices, getting an officially sanctioned controller seems to be the holy grail, and has only recently happened with the so-called Duo Gamer, which is a device which is only functional with specific Gameloft games, which is very odd indeed. It also costs $80. This thing is a hideous, hideous device indeed. It's not particularly good. It takes 2 AAA batteries, and the reason that it's special is that this thing interfaces directly with the iPad. It doesn't use this janky keyboard emulation method in order to make it work, which is what all the other stuff does at the moment, which is limiting in many respects. You're not going to get true analog control and gameplay that way. Now, perhaps you might be looking for me to denounce once again the mobile gaming market and claim that it is, of course, a wasteland devoid of innovation and interesting gameplay mechanics, but honestly I'm not going to do that because I've never been someone that really cares about what a game is played on. What matters is the way that the game is designed. Now consider, if you will, the way that games are made for iOS devices, or indeed, of course, for the Android. They have to make an assumption. Their biggest assumption they've got to make is that this game will be played on the go. It is a mobile device, ergo one would think that the games would be played while mobile. The second assumption that must be made is that this game must control well with a touchscreen. It must be assumed that no controller is present. This actually does more damage than you can possibly imagine. There are games with a ton of potential that are limited very much by the fact that you have to use a touchscreen for controls, and most traditional gameplay models do not work very well with a touchscreen. And if we were to talk about the Duo Gamer, for instance, we talk about Gameloft, they put out a bunch of clone games, including Modern Combat 3 and Nova 3, which are clones of Call of Duty and Halo, respectively. These are first-person shooters, and if there is one device I hate playing FPS on more than a console, it's on a goddamn touchscreen. Now consider what could end up happening if this kind of thing takes off. If gamers get it into their heads that it's actually worth using a mobile device as a console that hooks up to your television and you use a Bluetooth controller for, what's going to happen is we will see a shift in the kind of games that are created for those platforms. That is vitally important. Right now, we are limited in terms of the amount of games that we can get for that system, which are interesting to core gamers because you just can't control them accurately. If you could, then the only real limitation comes down to the power of the actual system itself. And as I've said many times before, the current consoles we've got are not actually that powerful at all, and there are many ways to create really interesting games that don't rely too much on graphical prowess. So this could really genuinely be a good thing indeed. I could see a big revival of a lot of old school styles of games, old school style platformers, shooters, run and gun games, brawlers, fighting games. These kind of things could work really well on this kind of device. Not only that, but they could also be a lot cheaper. The thing about the mobile market is that these games are much, much cheaper than traditional releases, and that could open up a whole new world of budget gaming on a budget system that you already own because, of course, you got it with your phone contract. This could work out. It really, really could. I'm looking forward to seeing how this goes, and I know that might sound like a really weird statement, but I've just given you my reasons for that. Mobile games are not inherently bad. They are limited because of the interface that you are forced to design for and the assumption that these things will be played on the go. That's why you get such short games. They're designed for toilet gaming, for filling in little parts of the day. You don't have complexity because that's not what people want in that kind of scenario, and you can't implement it with a touchscreen anyway. You don't have precision controls, which shuts down a bunch of different genres. So let's see where this goes. I'm hoping, very much so, that we do see a resurgence. I mean, hell, I could play Quake 3 on an Android device. Imagine if I had a controller that would work well. Imagine if I could even put a mouse and keyboard into this thing and have it work just as well as it would on a PC. There are possibilities. And finally, it seems like a very long time since we've heard something awesome about Capcom. Well, it would appear to be happening, because in a recent investor call, Capcom told its investors that it will be improving the quality of its games by creating a larger percentage of the project internally. In order to make that happen, they are looking to add 1,000 more workers to their current team of 1,500 over the course of the next 10 years to make that happen. This is actually huge. It really is, because lately, Capcom has been outsourcing a number of different games. Although I must say that recently, the criticism has very much been leveled at a game that was developed internally, that being Resident Evil 6. The article names a couple of games that stick out in the minds of people, no doubt. Grin's Bionic Commando reboot, and of course Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City, which was a complete buggy mess, developed by Slant 6 Games. I don't know about you, but Capcom used to be one of my favorite devs and publishers. They've made a great deal of missteps and are showing a colossal amount of arrogance, as well as anti-consumer practice in the form of on-disc DLC and aggressive pricing. That's something that I think can be changed. I don't know if whether or not adding 1,000 workers to the team is really going to do that, but I think what's most important is that they are actively responding to criticism of some of their policies and are looking to improve things. I really don't think that it's a good idea, for instance, to give Lost Planet 3 to Spark Unlimited, the guys who are responsible for Turning Point, which was not a good game at all. Capcom is responsible for some of my favorite franchises. They are very competent. When they try, when they do everything right, they produce some of the best games anyone can possibly do. They marry Western and Japanese gameplay ideals perfectly in order to create a product which is genuinely entertaining and very engaging for the core gamer. But they have lost their way as of late. So, finally a little positivity in the AAA scene from Capcom there, so it is very much appreciated that they are at least taking some steps to remedy some of the problems that they've been suffering of late. My hope is that they use those workers well, and that they get over some of their trademark arrogance and get back to what made their games truly great in the first place. Alright folks, that wraps me up for the day. Thank you very much for listening to the content patch. I would like to let you know the election's done. It's over. You know what that means? No more political ads. This is good news. For those of you who installed an ad blocker over the course of the election, I do not blame you at all. My wife is currently giving me the middle finger over there because I believe she did exactly the same thing. Don't grin at me. I know what you're like. So, it's totally understandable. Just, I want to point out that ad blockers do actually hurt the content producers that you really like. This is basically our livelihood. It's what we make our money with. It pays our wages. So I definitely understand why you'd want to use an ad blocker, especially over the election season. It has been pretty much insufferable, but the election is over, and I know that all of the game content creators on YouTube would very much appreciate it if you were able to remove your ad blocker once again. I think I speak for all of the content creators on YouTube when I say we very much appreciate your support. It's really cool to be able to bring you this content on a regular basis and actually do it full time, and you guys are, of course, the reason why we are able to do that. Thanks a lot, and I shall see you next time.